Thank you. Hi, everybody. How are you all doing, by the way? Are you awake? Are you yeah? Brilliant. We're James. I'm James. This is Emma from CX Partners in Bristol, and we're going to talk about choosing research methods, basically. We also have a book to plug, but we haven't written it yet, so I don't know if that's okay or not, but that gets it out of the way, doesn't it? So I'm hoping that choosing research methods is something that speaks to a room full of researchers, is something that you do on a regular basis. But am I right to make that assumption? Who does get involved in choosing research methods? Thank God for that. Okay. Good. Okay, well, hopefully there'll be something in here that will be familiar or resonate with you on some level. I'm also very conscious that we don't want to teach you to suck eggs. So what we're talking about here isn't, what method is good for this and what method is good for that. It's not about strengths and weaknesses. It's more a kind of reflection on the process of choosing. And I guess some of the pitfalls that arise in that process and some of the ways that we've tried to find to kind of, not completely dodge those pitfalls, but certainly wriggle our way around them a little bit. So hopefully there'll be something useful in reflecting on that. This is the central question for us, really. When you're faced with a new research challenge, how do you decide what method or methods to use to take that challenge on? Is it about being contextual? Is it about staying in the lab? Is it about depth interviews, or is it about doing something with groups? Is it about doing something quantitative, or is it, is your instinct to stick to qualitative research most often? Do you do something simple? Do you do something that's more intricate, that's multi-method in some way? So those kinds of quandaries are the sort of thing that we're talking about here. How do you arrive at an answer by doing that? And I think the thing that occurred to me as we were reflecting on this in the run-up is actually often these compromises can be a bit awkward. They can be a bit tricky. And you can find yourself having to trade off things maybe that you're not that comfortable trading off, that you feel like you've lost something or there's something just a little bit unsatisfactory about where you've ended up. That's certainly something that I feel quite often when I'm kind of juggling different research methods. And the other thing that we were reflecting on was, do we have a formula? I'd be interested to know if anyone here actually has like a really concrete formula for doing this. I came to the conclusion that we really don't. It's something that's a bit more kind of heuristic than that. It's a bit more of a kind of a feel. But what we're going to share with you is a set of thinking tools, really, that help you to kind of work through that process, I hope. And face up to the compromises that are involved in this, and perhaps just find a slightly better way of working with them. And in doing so, we're going to kind of home in on and kind of pull apart two aspects of this decision. Firstly, what we've kind of come to label the rules perspective. So this is the idea that if you know what the brief is, if you know what the challenge is, and you've got a set of criteria that you can apply to that challenge, there is a right choice. There's a kind of best fit solution that if you just apply those rules correctly, you'll end up with. And against that, there's another way of looking at it, which is the kind of people perspective, which is the idea that this is a decision that should involve other people. It certainly affects other people. It should hopefully end up engaging other people as well. And so that's not really about a set of criteria. It's about a kind of creative, very human process that you're going to work through in collaboration. So I'm going to talk about the rules perspective, and then I'm going to hand over to Emma to talk more about the people perspective and some of the things that we might do to kind of joyously bring those two things together into a harmonious whole. So, the rules perspective. When I think about this, this is kind of the way that I was taught to make these choices. And I think if you opened up a textbook about research, probably this is the kind of process that would be laid out in that textbook. It's a process of weighing up different considerations and criteria to arrive at an optimal approach to tackling the problem. And at CX Partners, we've got a way of doing this, which is about asking ourselves some questions. So we've got these 5 questions, broadly speaking, that we think if you kind of ask yourself these questions, at least by the kind of rules perspective, you will end up with something like an optimal approach. So let's just look at each of these. The first one obviously what stage of the product life cycle are you at? Because, as we all know, there are some methods that are associated, or at least more optimal for certain places on this than others. So you'll have some things that feel right at the beginning. An ethnography is really immersive, but it's really resource hungry as well. Probably not worth doing that later on when you're testing a solution necessarily. And similarly, you wouldn't be able to use analytics very much at the beginning of a project, but you've got a lot more opportunity once you've launched something. Once there's something to actually monitor in the real world. So the first thing, just where are you? The second thing, size of investment. And I think you can think about this in terms of investment of time or effort. You can think about it as we tend to in terms of a budget that's associated with tackling a challenge. But really this is about how important is the question you're trying to answer. And I think while we would all hopefully in a room like this agree that research is generally a good investment, I think we've also got to acknowledge it is a cost as well. And so the question we're asking ourselves is, are we achieving the right cost-benefit ratio for the thing that we're trying to get to grips with? Because you can only really justify research where it's proportionate to the cost of finding out. If you've got a small risk that you're managing, a small launch that you're working towards, you can't absolutely go crazy with that in terms of the research program that you're going to roll out to explore it. If it's a real game changer for your organization, then the opposite would be true. You wouldn't want to use a really lightweight piece of research to do that. And another way of visualizing this, which I must credit to Christy Blazo, is how many times do you want to cycle round a kind of qual-quant spiral until you get to good enough, basically. Because almost never do you need to keep looping around this until you've got the whole story. Good enough is good enough. You can make a decision. There are probably better things to spend your money on at that point. The third question that we kind of home in on when we're doing this is the mix of insight and evidence and ideas that your method or methods may generate. Let me just kind of unpack that a little bit. So when we think about research, we think about it producing three things. One is insight, so what did I learn? Another one is evidence, so all right, I might be convinced that this is the way the world is, but I've got really skeptical stakeholders who just don't buy this, so do I need to bring them with me on that journey? And then ideas, do I need some direction? Do I need to be kind of pointing a certain way at the end of this? And because different methods are good at producing these things in different proportions, it's just a really good idea to reflect on this at the beginning, because if the reason you're doing research is to settle an argument or to kind of win somebody over who maybe is very resistant to seeing things from a user's point of view, you probably want to emphasize evidence. It's similarly, if you're just trying to generate some new ideas, then you'll do things differently. In the former, eye tracking is a really powerful methodology, but maybe it's different for everyone else. I've never really seen eye tracking as a kind of idea generating methodology. It's very good at just, there's something you can't argue with. Co-design is the opposite, and so forth. I'm not going to say much about this because hopefully it speaks to itself, but everything, if anyone's got a better word than thing, please let me know. But the thing that you're researching, if it's an IA, obviously card sorting and tree testing are going to be on your mind. And so on for other types of need. And then finally, just how close to the moment of truth do you need to get? So if it's something that you need to be there, you need to be seeing it, you need to be witnessing it happen, either because people won't remember it, or they won't recall it correctly, or they won't recall it honestly afterwards, then that calls on a different toolkit than if it's something that you could ask people about a year after the event. So there was the example of, was it raining on the day you bought your car? You can ask that because you don't buy a car very often. If you wanted to know how often somebody takes their phone out of their pocket on a given day, you kind of need to find a different way of doing that because they won't be able to tell you. So from a purely rules perspective, we think if you've got answers to those 5 questions, you can choose a method, you've got a response. And I guess the other question is, well, how then do you do that? And there are various ways to do that, to apply those answers to come up with something. I've seen this done in, as card sorts. I think, a time-honoured way is just to sit around a table with your colleagues and thrash it out in a conversation. You could even reference it in a book if you're not quite sure. And there are some, there are some online resources that tell you as well. We've played with a kind of method chooser thing. We're trying to put something together which kind of encapsulates those questions. And at a cruder level, you could just put them in a table and kind of read across it. But I think generally it's a bit more fluid than that, because what we're probably doing, as people who are perhaps relatively practiced or expert in making this decision, is doing it in a more organic way. We're bringing past experience, the specifics of the brief, and gut feel. And so the questions that we've just gone through are more there as a kind of a framework, a structure to go with. But I just want to kind of draw a kind of halfway line in this presentation here, because really, if the rules-based approach is the only perspective that you're bringing to this, then really you're missing out on the thing that's actually the engine of making research have an impact, which is the people. And I think you run the risk of producing something which is technically correct but really sterile if you just take this approach. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to Emma, who's going to say more about that side of things.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Hello, afternoon all. Proper glad I didn't trip up that. That was what I was thinking as I come to step up on stage. Cool, all right then. So yeah, as James said, I'm going to talk about the people perspective. So it's probably worth saying that what we mean by people is the people that are in your team running the research, so not necessarily the participants themselves at this point. So what this perspective is considering is your team and the level of engagement that your team have and the experience that they have by doing the research with you. So we're all UXers, we enjoy making a good experience. So with this approach, it's thinking about how do we foster a research environment that's fun for our team. So there are probably about 3 things that you need to consider if you're using this approach to pick a research method. So the first one is team context. So by that we mean the people in your team, behaviours or common traits that they might share or exhibit. So just considering them and how that might influence what type of method you want to use with that team. Engagement, that's another thing that you want to think about. So how involved do you want your team to be? What level of exposure do you want them to have to the research that you're running? And how involved do you want them to be? And then finally you as the researcher, you're really important as well, and it's worth emphasising that. So team context. So there's lots of things that could be going on in your research projects that might influence the type of method that you want to pick to do. So let's say, for example, you might be working with a team that's really innovative and really experimental. So for them, they maybe want to try a method that's a little bit more creative or unusual. Similarly, you might have been working with a team for a really long period of time, so 6 to 12 months. Smooth. And so doing the same method week in, week out, that is going to be pretty dull. Equally, as a researcher, it doesn't give you the opportunity to sort of show off what you're capable of doing and all of the other tools that we have available to us. You also need to think about the culture of your team. So let's say, for example, you're working with a team that are pretty strategic. So they're really good at looking at the big picture. But perhaps for this bit of research, you want them to sit from a slightly different angle. So we can use our method to help shift people's viewpoints. So for that strategic team, we might pick a method that helps them get into the detail a little bit more. So we've spoken about team context and how that might influence the type of method that we pick. But now we probably want to consider what we want to achieve by the method that we use. So the right method, according to the rules-based approach that James just spoke through, may not be the one that generates the most closeness or engagement within your team. And having a tight team can be really important. If you've got that shared vision, that can really have an impact on how influential and how successful your project is. So often just delivering a presentation or a report at the end of a research project, it doesn't always have the impact that we might want. Worst case scenario, you might present some findings that are particularly difficult or challenging for your team to hear. If they haven't been on that journey with you, it can come as a bit of a shock, and that's not nice for either side. But if you take your team on that journey with you, not only do they get a really deep understanding of your process, they'll understand why you picked the method that you picked, and they'll be more bought in to what you're doing, so they'll have that greater level of understanding, and they'll feel like they own it as well, and that's a really positive thing for them, and it's positive for you. It means they're bought in to your methods, to your research and your findings. There's more opportunity for skill sharing among your team, And overall, we find that teams that work in this way are just more productive. So the final one was just around you as a researcher, so just taking sort of care of yourself and making sure that you've got the opportunity to challenge yourself and learn new skills and try new stuff out if you fancy it. It stops research getting dull and boring for us and just keeps things exciting and make sure that we're constantly sort of learning. So, picking a research method from a people perspective is all about taking people on a journey with you. So, by not taking a purist approach to picking a research method based on a set of rules or criteria, you can pick one that gets the wider team to engage. It helps them get involved, and it gets them excited as well, which is nice. Then you'll all get more out of it, and ultimately we believe that your research project has a little bit more impact if you work in this way. Okay. Ultimately, however, we think that both perspectives are important. So it's not about picking one or the other, as James said. You need the rigour of the rule-based approach to make sure that you pick a method that collects the right type of data, that collects valid data, and is achievable. But you also need the people perspective if you want your research to have impact. So if you want people to actually embrace, own, and act on your research, it's important to get them on board as well. So bringing these two perspectives can be a compromise, and it can also be quite awkward as well. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you have had to have debates around which research method is best for your project? Right, okay, right, it happens, right? And it definitely happens to us sometimes as well. So it may be that we're working alongside a client that they're really keen to use a particular approach that they're familiar with or that they're comfortable with. Let's take, for example, focus groups. But we might think that a better approach, for example, might be some user testing. And that's really awkward. It can be really challenging. We can't deny that. It can be difficult. But we've come up with around 5 ways that we use to help resolve that tension that we have. So the first thing that you can do is share that decision. So it's really easy, I think, for teams to get caught up in the notion that research design is solely down to the researcher because we have specialist knowledge that no one else has. And I don't think that's true. I think we can get the whole team involved in that decision. We can explain to them what the positives about certain methods are, what some of the negatives are, and then you can come to that agreement and decide on that method together as a team. And if you do that, they're more likely to stay engaged throughout the project. Another thing you can do is break up your programme of work into chunks and use different methods in each chunk. And that's really good if you've got competing requirements. You can use this approach to split up your methodologies to tackle each of them requirements in turn. So it might be that you want to focus on gathering insights at one point, and then you'll have a little look at collecting evidence a little later on in your project. Or it might be that you want more stakeholder involvement in one part, and then you want to focus on data collection a little bit more in another part. That can also help you build relationships with your stakeholders as you take them on that journey. So what you might want to do tactically is think about using them methods that they feel more familiar and safe with at the beginning of your project. And then as you get to know each other more and you gain trust and respect for each other, you can start maybe introducing them to methods that they're a little less familiar with or that are perhaps a little bit harder to engage with. So with our projects as well, what we also do is deliberately plan our engagement across a project that we have with a client. So really what we do is think of our project as a bit of a campaign, and along that campaign we have different touch points. So along these different touch points, think about what opportunities are there for your team to engage. So do you want to get them along to the interviews? While they're watching the interviews, do you want them to get involved in note-taking? Or is there something else that you need to do to bring that research to life for them? So do you want to show small clips, some highlights, or show them quotes? Think about as well what experience they will be having at each of these touch points. So are they super engaged? So the example I gave was taking notes in some lab testing. Or are they more passive? So are they listening to you talk about your research? Is there more that you could do to get them involved at certain points during your research? And the final thing is to consider what's appropriate for each audience at these touch points. So let's take, for example, a really time-poor senior stakeholder. The best thing for them might be a showreel of your highlight clips from your research and a real high-level summary of your findings. But for the wider team, it might do you better to get everyone together in a room, get some pizza, get some beers, have a talk about what you've been doing, show them some longer clips, have a bit more of a discussion with them. And so finally, as I mentioned earlier, as a researcher, you've got to try and use stuff as well. And that way you're constantly developing your skills and moving your practice forward. And I think that's really important if you're doing a method that you've done lots and lots in the past. It's really easy to become complacent. But if you're switching it up and you're using different methods, you've got fresh eyes each time that you're doing a piece of research, and that can only be a good thing. So what we do on our projects is we always try to include a small tweak or a little experiment when we're planning our project. So nothing that would jeopardise the delivery of the work that we're doing, but it's just something to sort of challenge ourselves that we can try out, something new maybe that we haven't done before. So, to sum it all up, we believe that good research design is fundamentally pretty simple. So there's a few key things to focus on. The first is you have to focus on the key questions. So what do you need answers to? Secondly, focus on the opportunities that you get as a researcher to develop your skills and practice. The third point is about engaging the people in your research team. So how do you get them involved? How do you make them feel like they own and they are part of the research as well? And fourthly, we've got to recognise that sometimes there is a tension between these two perspectives, so the rules-based perspective and the people perspective. But as good UXers, we should call that out and talk about it in the open, transparently. And we think that if you do them things when picking a research method, your project is more likely to translate into action because you have that buy-in from the wider team right from the beginning all the way through. You and your team will hopefully enjoy research a little bit more, and you'll be able to develop your skills as a researcher as well. Thank you.